So every drug, every manipulation, every electric shock was going to amount to basically nothing. And all the while, the third-year student was jumping up and down to get the attention of the chief running the code. Post-code, we watched the videotape together, and I had never seen a surgical chief resident cry before. But when he saw that tape, and it was so clear that the youngest person, least experienced, lowest guy on the totem pole had a piece of crucial information that could have saved the day, but of course he was ignored. Do you think that chief resident will run a better code in the future? I sure hope so. Do you think we could train and evaluate and study these tapes and show these tapes to other people? Sure we could. Sure we could. So that's in part going against the authority gradient with safety of the team, and in our case, the life of the patient at stake. We'll come back to this as well. So what are the tools for cooperation? I mean, in a part, this is a little corny, but can we actually stipulate what the tools are? I think we can. Developing a shared purpose, creating an open and safe environment, as the cases you've been working on patient safety throughout our time together. Encourage diverse viewpoints. Well, that's a tough one. Encourage diverse viewpoints. And learn how to negotiate agreement. Insist on equity in applying the rules. Insist on equity in applying the rules. Going back to going against the authority gradient, a long time ago, a really long time ago, I'm in the operating room with the author of Schwartz's textbook on surgery. You know, the big fat yellow one? So we're in the operating room with the man himself. It's a long time ago. And it was a gallbladder case, and I see that the chief resident, I'm like 14 feet away holding one retractor, and I see that the chief resident something is agitating this guy because he was a pretty cool cat. Surgery's done. We're in the locker room cleaning up afterwards, and I say, gee, so-and-so, what was going on in there? You looked kind of upset to me, and I'm just a third-year student. And he said, well, darn, you know, I could tell that we were cutting something we really probably shouldn't have, and I know we're going to have some post-op problems, and I know I'll be responsible for caring for these post-op problems, and I so naively said, so why the heck didn't you say anything while we were in there? And you can imagine what his answer was. I can't repeat it because we're on tape, but the reality is he looked at me as though to say that would have been my last conversation in the operating room. So the ability to go against the authority gradient, and each and every one of you can think of an example very comparable to that. So do you think we can teach cooperation? Can we teach systemness? Can we teach teamwork? Can we teach the tenets of crew resource management? It's a tough question. I think we can. Now part of the issue becomes when and where in the curriculum do we put all of this? Okay, so let's go back then to 1988. Back in 1988, we started to see articles in the New England Journal of Medicine and elsewhere talking about these issues of quality improvement. At around that time, Don Berwick wrote the Shattuck Lecture piece about the parable of the two apple orchards. Bear with me here for a moment. So one apple orchard, they just generally go about things their usual way, producing apples for market. The ones that are rotten get turned into apple cider, the others get turned into mush, and there you go. Then along comes another orchard not too far down the road where they study the irrigation, the soil science, the appropriate amount of nutrients, and their goal is to increase the yield of apples that can be brought to market. So the orchard that pays attention to irrigation, soil science, and so on, they're spending a fair amount of money in the first 2, 3, 4 years of operation. But by year 5, which would you guess, orchard doing things the usual way, or the second orchard 4 to 5 years down the quality road, who's got a greater yield of apples ready to deliver to market? So of course the answer is the orchard spending the time and energy looking at the process, if you would, of growing the apples. Now, when confronted when you and I are confronted with, gee, why did you pick that particular antibiotic? Why'd you do that particular test? Why'd you pick that particular catheter? Whatever the question is, our general normal human nature response is, as it says on the slide, thank you very much, my apple is just fine. It's your apple that we're worried about. And we've talked about the failure of, at least the peer-reviewed evidence, the failure of peer review, retrospective, chart-based peer review to really influence anything with regard to measuring and improving the quality. And that's part of what's built into the parable of the two apple orchards. One goes about its usual business with no demonstrable improvement in its total yield of apples to market. The other studies the process, commits resources, understands that 85% of the time any improvement is related to a change in the process. But when we're confronted on an individual basis at least, gee, there's something wrong with your apple, our normal human response is, oh yeah? Well, my apple's fine, thank you very much. Go read somebody else's chart for a change. Hang in there. Other aspects of our tightly held cultural beliefs, I think, could be pretty well summarized in two short sayings. Saying one, I once had a case, which of course, from an epidemiologic perspective, you know is an N of 1. But when a gray-haired senior clinician says, in case after case after case that I have cared for, he's really talking about an N of 3, right? So next time someone says, I once had a case, or in case after case, you can say, that's sweet. In God we trust, all others bring their outcomes data. That's the message. Tightly held belief number 2, in my experience. Well, yikes, just as bad as I once had a case. So I know no one here has ever heard either of these expressions, right? Okay, now stand by for number 2 in the list. Okay, so we've reviewed what systems thinking is. We know we've got to have measurement of what we do because you're only going to improve that which you measure. We know we're going to need leadership for these issues, and it's teachable. We know we're going to have to test the changes that we make. If you change the X-ray request form, how will you know if it's working or not? The only way is to evaluate and test, and you may have to change it again and change it yet a third time. This is why doing this kind of work is so tough. It's so much easier to say, 15% of the time it's that son of a gun whose handwriting we can't read. If we only get rid of him, that will fix the problem. And finally, cooperation, as we've talked about. So let's go back, though, and talk a little bit more about sort of the science basis, the scientific basis for what we're here talking about today. Well, if you went back and you studied Out of the Crisis and Deming, Duran, Crosby, Schuhart, and all the others, if they were somehow magically here with us today, they would tell us that the cost of our efforts to prevent, detect, and react to quality problems consumes about 20 to 40% of every revenue dollar. That's right. Of every pre-tax revenue dollar, we're wasting somewhere between 20 to 40% of that income. Why? Well, we waste it on what the quality world would call the concept of rework. Can you think of any rework that you and I do every day? My goodness. The reordering, the retesting, the readmission, the failure to connect the boxes of communication from primary care to acute care to rehabilitative care alone. The whole idea of linked communication, or in the language of quality, a more effective handoff of information from one component to another. So the reality here of 20 to 40% of every revenue dollar, maybe one answer to health reform might be if we could harness that wasted money and somehow plow that back into the system, maybe that would go a long way to helping us with the cost crisis. It's very akin to what we talked about previously in terms of the only way to really reduce cost is to reduce waste. That's really what we're saying here. But to study how to reduce waste takes energy itself and a knowledge of the system's nature of practice. Okay.